Now, I actually want to start a little bit broader than saying IoT, because what I find out in most of my customers, they're starting to think about a connected car, and ultimately what it all boils down to is it's not about cars, nor it is about, smartness of a thing. It is actually about the business models of the future. When we talked to, we had a project for a leading automotive player who actually started out to think about how can we actually compare in terms of the connected car service environment. And ultimately, after 2 weeks, we had a discussion with the CIO who said, actually, no, we're not talking about a connected car anymore. We're talking about the future of this company. Because obviously, we're talking about things that are adding up to what a car is, or we need to transform the whole organization to be able to provide services beyond the car. So it's not only about the connectivity of things that we need to talk about, and actually also these guys didn't consider if it's now e-business or if it's digital or if it's IoT or whatever. The disruption happens because business models are founded based on what is available in the technology space. So technology is obviously an enabler, but not the main driver for disruption. The main driver for disruption for us is actually moving from a pure hardware environment, from a manufacturing standpoint, from a vertical environment that you are as of today, as a telco, but also as a car manufacturer or as a window manufacturer or as a elevator manufacturer. If you consider yourself to be in a vertical and do not open up to other players, then ultimately you're dead. So these actually are sort of historical points, and just to add to the point, we had obviously Arthur D. Little has done a study as well on digital. Just to give you some figures, basically what we found out is that the companies that we interviewed, 60% of them are only considering digital as important, but they don't have a strategy yet. So it is a quite interesting discussion, because obviously digital, if you browse LinkedIn or whatever network you're on, IoT, digital is all over the place, and everyone has found the solution for being whatever, but at the end of the day, nothing is really implemented. No one really has a clue about that, which is good for telcos if they have the answer in the first place. But that's about to the discussion we have today, and I think your insights already proved to the case that maybe there's a little bit of misunderstanding as well. As a matter of fact, these guys, and we have done that on a segment, on a sector level, the ones who are considering themselves the most advanced in digital are, make a guess? Telcos? Wrong, second. Who do you consider, who would you say is, or would you believe is believing they're the most advanced ones in digital? Car manufacturers. So that's about self-perception. It's really an interesting point that lots of these players are actually considering themselves being successful in the digital space, which they're not, to be honest. But this is actually the point that this kind of study brought up. And again, opening up the space, when we talk about all of these buzzwords like smart cities or connected cars or smart grids or whatever, these are all vertical plays. And 2 years or 3 years ago when I was here, we had actually talked about these verticals a lot, because we thought, okay, in which vertical do we actually need to engage as a telco in the first place, because we obviously have the best reputation, the best possible ways to enter. Now, eventually, what comes now is that we say, wait a second, there is actually a wrapper around that. Because obviously the internet, or the use cases, or the verticals that we define are artificial in nature. For a customer, it doesn't make, the customer doesn't distinguish if in a smart city you have a mobility solution that is not connected to a building or whatever. The customer, the citizen, doesn't consider verticals. They're using most of the time multiple use cases that are running across multiple verticals. So all of that, what we have here, consumer electronics, etc., is somewhat linked to each other. So we need to have this wrapper around that, and we used to call it Internet of Things, Internet of Services, Internet of Humans, whatever. And at the end of the day, we obviously have to talk about the Internet of Everything. And as this is a little bit of a problem, because basically it is a buzzword again, I usually refer to that as saying, think about services, not hardware. And we come to that, I'm going to show you some slides on that later. And I think if we actually tear down the vertical distinguishing factors that we believe are there between a car and a service, or between a house and the security, or between the city and the well-being of a citizen. As soon as we break down these barriers, we are actually opening up and converging lots of these use cases, lots of the requirements from the customers that make it more attractive for them to actually adopt. But that obviously is complicated in nature for most of the telcos these days. And I'm going to come to that example as well. This slide actually I've shown slightly differently already 3 years ago. I can show it because it's a value chain, and usually value chains don't change. So what we see is that there are obviously players such as hardware manufacturers building the connectivity bits. Then we have the network providers and the connectivity providers. Unfortunately, the money that they get out of the value percentage-wise is relatively slim, and it's actually even degrading. When we see, and I'm involved in lots of the M2M connectivity bits that operators are doing these days, well, being a consumer, knowing how much you actually have to pay in roaming when you use data, it is really, really disrupting your image of a telco if you see what the prices are that you get on an international scale for connectivity in the big chunk of gigabytes. So ultimately, I think this will actually be even lower in the future. We see two major rising points, more interesting points. Obviously, that's the service enabling. So we talk about not only the technical platform, we're actually talking about the ability to manage and to constitute and to run an ecosystem of partners. So it's not about the technical integration. Technical integration is probably the least problem that we have because there's so many platforms out there that can connect. So I think in terms of the technology, we're not discussing here really. We're actually what we need to talk about is how can telcos become kind of a general contractor to actually enable partnerships with other ecosystem players or for other ecosystem players. I'll give you an example on the smart home environment. When we talk about smart home, usually it's an end consumer approach, other than Quivicon, but don't quote me on that one, that actually will, is constituting of some hardware and some connectivity and a little bit of a service around that. What we're neglecting there is that obviously the ecosystem behind, in terms of the washing machine provider, the glass manufacturer, the window guys who are actually installing the windows, the central heating guys, et cetera, are not part of this equation. So what we do is basically we are selling a piece of hardware like a smartphone with a little bit of an intelligence in it, but actually the customer doesn't want that. And it's not surprising because he doesn't realize any benefits out of that. If we would sell a security solution, including glass breakage, et cetera, even maybe on in a factory fitted line, that would be definitely more the propensity to buy and actually to sell, to pay for that would be extremely high. Yeah, this is just an example of the players that we see right now as one of the example use cases. We see the smart home environment, and again, what we're neglecting, and I have to move a little bit, right? What we're neglecting completely as of today in the value chain as telcos is that this part here is completely not addressed by us as telcos. What we do is we do this kind of stuff here. We service enabling, a little bit of integration, but again, the Bosch maybe not, but the Fissmann is too small to create an ecosystem on their own. So what they're doing is they're standing in vertical. They're putting smart things in their own stuff, but that doesn't connect to anything else in the home or in whatever reason. If you've been to the CES or to the IFA last year or this year, Samsung has something, Miele has something, Siemens has something. If you want to manage your smart home, if you have a smart home, you actually have to have a very big screen where all of these apps verticalized are on it. Does that create value? No, it doesn't. Because obviously, why should the toaster, I mean, you can ask the question, why should the toaster talk to the washing machine? That's probably what I wanted to talk about. But if you think about a use case like security or convenience or even, energy, you have so many different parts in the home that you actually need to connect to make it really valuable. In the security environment, and we did a project, as I said, for a window manufacturer. The window manufacturer wanted to know what is actually my role in a smart home. And I have to admit, after the project, I sensed that the windows are probably one of the most underrated parts of a smart home because there are so many. And there's so much progress going on in concerning technologies. So actually linking these rather small and medium-sized companies that are actually definitely searching for someone to enable them to be part of a larger ecosystem, that has been, as of today, from my side, been relatively neglected from the telcos. Next point, the smartization of things. We've seen the Tag Heuer smartwatch. They are actually starting with a physical smartwatch, or actually they're starting with a watch. And then they put some enablement on it, and all of a sudden they have a digital enabled product. Now, again, you still have the ability to read the time, but you have obviously more services on top of that. These services, most of the time, are actually provided, or they're trying to provide them all on their own as their own services. But there actually already the equation of the partnerships comes into play, because obviously you will not be able to provide all of these services on your own, nor should you, because it takes too long to actually bring them to the market. Samsung, for example, now is actually one of the examples of moving out of the car, because obviously you can now, within the BMW, you can also manage your home, which is nice. But there are other things that actually are starting to emerge in that respect. Again, when we're talking about moving from product to service, we have to acknowledge that most of the players out there, the B2B players, the manufacturers, are coming from a world where they don't have services. And they're not, not accustomed to services. Now, someone could argue, is a telco actually a service provider, or are they actually selling a piece of hardware with a SIM card? Sometimes, and according to what you said as well, the organization of telcos is still very much as well manufacturing driven. So they're very much lean, they're very much in silos, very much in vertical oriented solutions. So the same holds true to a certain extent for telcos. But we need to move to this services space, because the services space is the space where we will eventually create the value and the revenues, continuous revenues, not one-time revenues, but continuous revenues. But this is a big, cultural change, and it's also requiring a lot of organizational changes. Because most of the time, when I talk about the car manufacturer in that respect, you have the IT guys talking about IoT, you have the marketing guys talking about services, and you have the IT marketing and the R&D guys who are also talking about it. But they all talk different languages, and they don't talk to each other. So what comes out of it is a plethora of small little ideas that never actually will come to fruition, because they're not cooperating in that respect. So this layering, as you would call it, IoT organization, central IoT organization, I wouldn't call it that way. I would actually say it's a product house, because there you actually also need to understand that developing something that is digital or smart, and you want to put it back into your core, is one of the key essence points of success. Now, if you just do something separately and then you say, hey, by the way, we have a very, very funny thing that you can now put into the car, most of the people that are producing cars would say, nah, tried that, didn't work, or too expensive, or I don't know, I don't like the color. This is basically the point where you actually have this not invented here syndrome. So but you need, as a company, eventually to consider that IoT, digital, however you want to call it, is an integral part of your development, an integral part of your business, an integral part of your organization. The CIO of this car manufacturer actually asked me, Mr. Schlautmann, when can we finally get rid of this funny word? He didn't use the word funny. Digital. Because digital is something that distinguishes it from analog, basically. But actually, what we're talking about here is not digital, is not IoT, is actually the future of businesses in manufacturing and in the service space. IoT, digital platforms, that's all enabling, that's all fine, but the big thing, the big problem is the business model, okay? And the culture for that. I'm going to skip that one for the time being. When we think about, okay, what can actually IoT do, or what can we improve by using these technologies, we have actually, and that drives me eventually to also why telco should invest into that. You have actually 4 different, revenue sources. Number one, obviously, you have the product. That's the car. Then by actually using smart technologies to improve your processes is the cost reduction part. So you can use it internally. That's sort of the industry 4.0, again a buzzword, sorry for that, but this is basically the story that is below that. But then on top you need the product related services. For example, you have the telemetry, you have smart pay as you drive, whatever. This is very much related to the product itself. This is the second part, the product related service. You have the value add, where you, for example, have insurance companies paying for your hardware because they're actually getting data from you. But then on the very top, you have the ecosystem enablement sources. And in that respect, you will need to be much more open in terms of provisioning and provisioning mechanisms. And we just did a short, probably not completely full logic that we actually deploy in a smart city. You have different kinds of payment mechanisms, you have different kind of business model logics behind that. Now consider yourself as a telco, you probably would say, at least the ones in the middle, I know because I do that. If you ask a utility, they say, well, probably we're not doing any of those or little. So telcos actually, well, let's say in theory, you as telcos have a very good ability to offer these kinds of services, these kinds of provisioning models, because you do that. The problem is that most of the time we're actually talking still about the customer has to pay. These models imply that not only the customer has to pay, but also the ecosystem players that are part of this solution. And obviously when we talk about that, we talk also about, we also talk about revenue share models, and we talk about new business models. You have had the question, is it B2B or B2C in the future? What we see as IDL, it's neither of those. We will actually see most of the time B2B2C models, which is a huge problem now for telcos these days. I'm supporting an M2M deal right now where a car manufacturer, a different one from what we had, but the car manufacturer actually wants to put in a Wi-Fi hotspot in the car, plus having the telematic data provided by the car. Now, the telematic data part, that's a purely B2B product, okay? So the telco would sell on the B2B case and everything would be fine. But by including a Wi-Fi hotspot, you all of a sudden have a direct customer relation as the operator. Now, how do you actually implement that in your systems? Honestly, you can't. And that's a huge problem because you as telcos are exactly the same as the manufacturers outside there. You have verticals that are saying we have B2B, we have B2C and nothing in between. Eventually you as telcos, but also the others, need to change and understand that it's not about, at least not in the back end, you're not distinguishing anymore. What you will have to become as telcos is service enablers, and that needs to be much, much more flexible and much, much more let's say, platformish than what you're currently doing. So please tear down your B2B and B2C IT architecture systems, whatever, because you need to have that layer of integration between them. These business models will be very much applied. If you think about consumer electronics, if you think about cars, even if you think about solutions in malls, so buildings, etc., it will always be, to a certain extent, you as the enabler, you're the B in the B2B2C, but then obviously you need to provide that as well to the end customer. Another great thing, and this is actually, let me animate that. Another great thing for telcos is obviously you have the scale and you have the potential to actually provide differentiation for global customers. We're talking about, again, car manufacturers, we're talking about consumer electronic guys, we're talking even about, you know, aviation industry, we're talking about big things that are actually, we're talking about elevators for crying out loud, that are actually, you know, internationally sold. What has been in the past is basically you know, some of them actually still try to be here in this very much regional space. What we see now with the emergence of the Bridge Alliance in Asia Pac, GMA in Europe, Vodafone as one of the big players, we see Jasper, that these two areas that are highlighted here, high consumption data, for example, where you definitely cannot do it via roaming because it will be too expensive. And we talk about in a car, we have a customer, quite innovative one, I have to say, and it's not running on oil, on gasoline. They have an average data consumption as of today of more than 1.6 gigabytes average, not including self-driving. If you consider self-driving as part of the equation, then you're up to 5 to 10 gigabytes. So you don't want to use that via roaming, to be honest. So these are actually opportunities for telcos as well to improve their differentiation towards the big global industry. But funnily enough, and this is actually my last slide, and I hope that I'm more or less in time. Funnily enough, having talked about so much convergence and different industries, the key building blocks for defining a successful strategy for in the IoT space, or in this new field, I really hate the word IoT, is actually those 5 pillars. What is your strategy? Where do you want to go with this kind of story? Do you really want to go into services? Do you really want to be an enabler for something, as a telco, for example? And what does that imply for me? Do we have actually CEO understanding? The window manufacturer that I talked earlier about, the CFO told me, I want to sell more windows. I said, no, you're not. With that, you will not sell more windows. With that, you will sell services. And eventually, maybe you will sell more windows. But the main criteria is you will become part of an ecosystem that is much more beneficial and therefore also has a higher price than just selling stupid windows. So second thing is actually then when you have sort of an agreement reached in companies, and I'm quite interested to talk to this Telenor guy because anyways, the second question actually is, what is your service and product portfolio? So how far do you want to go? Do you really want to, as a car manufacturer, do you just want to stay around the car, or do you want to go outside the car as well? For example, Volvo and Audi now subsequently have this delivery to the trunk. Now, questionable if that is really a very meaningful, if that would be my first use case I want to implement. But still, they're actually already considering, well, if I have this kind of service, why do I actually just keep it for my cars? I can, bring up the community here and use that cross brands, because it's essentially the customer is not buying the car for that, or is not buying the car to have the service, but the services can be sold on top. So these are questions that are surrounding that. Obviously, one of the key criteria is when you have defined a certain service and product portfolio, you need to find the partners. And again, as you correctly said, most of telcos tend to say, oh no, I'm going to build that all myself, which takes very long, usually is unsuccessful, and doesn't meet the market requirements. And we've seen that in the IoT space, there's a lot of players out there where telcos can actually very much use their capabilities. It's not about letting competitors in, it's actually about creating this ecosystem approach, and that is sort of the underlying assumption. You will actually have or someone who probably wants to be in the same ballpark as you are, but you are actually tying them together. You're the general contractor for the solution. That has to be your aim, not the aim of the providers, the additional partners. Fourth point, organizational setup. We talked about this product house, or you said this IoT division. As I said, I prefer the word product house. But you had a lot of discussions as well on the chief digital officer. I think some of you remember this hype, which also has to a certain extent gone a little bit down, because obviously a king without land is meaningless, and usually this is the position that they have. And on the fifth point, and deliberately put at the end, is really the technology question. We have looked into smart home platforms, for example. Gosh, there are hundreds, there are thousands. You don't need to, you don't need to create some kind of I want to go just with that one. It's that the opposite has to be the case. You need to find something that is replaceable, that is open, so you can actually use it and tie in as much as possible your partners. So a complete different mindset to what IT usually does. They want to differentiate by building something that is much more smarter than everything else in the world. No, you need to actually do the other way around. You put the intelligence on to something that is relatively standard in nature. That's sort of our stance, and this is actually what we did. Some of these logos obviously are our customers, so that's where we actually, or what we do usually as Arthur D. Little, to go through these 5 points with our customers to transform them. And this is what we're doing. Thank you very much for that.